Shirley Sedawie was a member of the congregation of Notre Dame de Sion, commonly known in Australia as the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion. In the aftermath of World War II, an important goal in the congregation became the promotion and development of a relationship of trust and respectful dialogue between Christians and Jews. As a consequence, sisters were encouraged to undertake studies in Israel. After a year's study in Jerusalem in 1962, Shirley returned to Melbourne, more than ever convinced that her life's focus and work lay in fostering a mutual relationship and dialogue between Jews and Christians. From 1963 to 1966, she studied for an arts degree at Melbourne University, specialising in Semitic languages and Middle Eastern thought. She completed her master's in 1970. The thesis was entitled "The Beginnings of the Conflict Between Christians and Jews." As she was gaining a solid foundation of knowledge in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, Shirley pioneered the opening of a Centre for Jewish-Christian Dialogue at Box Hill in 1964. This centre had as its primary aim to better inform Christians of their Jewish roots and to assist Jews and Christians in getting to know one another as unique persons and as friends, with the aim of breaking down any preconceived, prejudicial ideas that might otherwise lead to acts of intolerance or anti-Semitism. In 1970, as science work developed, the Centre for Jewish-Christian Dialogue was relocated in Kew and a specialised library was established. During this innovative work, Shirley received extraordinary support and help for guidance from Rabbi John Levi and the Reverend Robert Anderson. Along with Sister Lenore Sherry, Shirley welcomed an increasing number of Christian groups seeking knowledge about Judaism. Jews and Christians who were open to meet each other began to gather in a friendly environment of the centre to share on questions of faith and mutual concern. Several Jewish people who had arrived in Australia after World War II, marked by the traumatic experiences of the Shoah, found in Shirley a lifelong trusted friend with whom they could share their life journey, past and present. In 1977, Shirley had further study time in Jerusalem, and in 1978 became the director of the Sion International Team at the Centre for Jewish-Christian Relations in Rome. In this capacity, she was responsible for the publication of a journal which was entitled International Jewish Christian Documentation Service, commonly known as CJJ, printed quarterly in 3 languages and circulated in 26 countries. This publication had as its focus the communication of important information on the progress of Jewish-Christian dialogue in different countries. It was an important resource for those involved in interfaith studies. Other dimensions of Shirley's work in Rome included liaison with the Vatican's Department for Relations with Judaism and the Jewish people. As a guest lecturer at the International Pontifical Gregorian University, she offered the students a correct historical and theological understanding of the important developments made by the Church in Jewish, Christian and interfaith dialogue. Returning to Sydney in 1988, Shirley re-established with Rabbi Apple and other interested persons the New South Wales Council of Christians and Jews. After 2 years, she came back to Melbourne, immediately becoming a member of the executive of the Council of Christians and Jews Victoria. For over 40 years of her life, Shirley was passionate about and faithfully committed to creating strong connections of mutual respect, trust, and friendship among all peoples, especially among Jews and Christians. As a result, a bond of mutual understanding, ease in relationship, and trust now exists between many people of our two communities in Melbourne and Sydney, as well as in many other parts of the world. Shirley's work has touched the very fabric of what this country desires for its future prosperity, the recognition that each person, whoever she or he is, has the right to enjoy self-definition, respect, dignity, freedom, and to live in justice and peace with others in this beautiful land we call Australia.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's my pleasure now to welcome and introduce Dr. Debbie Weissman. I was thinking this morning, I've got a beautiful connection to Shirley Sedawie and to Debbie, and that connection is table. Anyone who's met Debbie will know that Shabbat is very much an anchor and in her own life. And I've been lucky enough to share the Shabbat table with Debbie on a number of occasions. And I'm also conscious that Shirley Sedawie introduced me to the Aleph Bet around the kitchen table with the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion in Melbourne. So just a little bit about Debbie Weissman. Debbie was the first female president of the International Council of Christians and Jews, and she was president between 2008 and 2014. She is an Orthodox Jew, has taught Jewish education and women's studies at Hebrew University. She is an activist for peace. She is a person of dialogue, and it is my pleasure to introduce her now to deliver the 2020 Shirley Sedawie Oration. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you so much, Mark. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
Good, okay. I know that you were expecting me to join the call much earlier on so we could make sure that everything was working probably. Unfortunately, I wasn't working properly and I had some difficulty, and I apologize for being late. And I did catch part of Mary's beautiful biographical description of Sister Shirley, but I missed the beginning, and I do apologize for that. I was told that you should never apologize at the beginning of a talk, but I'm going to give a second apology, not only for being late, but for the mess that my hair is in. That, unfortunately, is not my fault. That's because of the lockdown here in Israel, where we can't go to beauty parlors and barbershops. And you know about lockdowns in Melbourne. So I'm hoping that perhaps in another week or two, I'll be able to go to my hairdresser and do something with this. But enough apologizing. I want to say good morning to those of you in Israel. There are a few people from Israel. Good afternoon to the Australians. And if there's anyone from New Zealand, it's probably already good evening. I am very honored to have been invited to speak on this important occasion. I did read up a little bit on the internet about Sister Shirley. I never had the opportunity to meet her. She had been at Ecce Homo here in Jerusalem, but she left for Australia just about the time that I began to get involved. So it's very special for me to be here, and I looked at the list of participants and some wonderful friends whom I see a lot and some whom I haven't seen in many months, and it's great to have you. I have been to Australia 7 times, physically, and this is probably the first time that I've been there virtually. So I hope I will be able to go back physically again. Let's begin with the first slide, if that's possible. I'm depending on Mark to handle that. One of the chat says, Zoom isn't good enough to show a bad hair day. And someone else said that it looks okay to him. So I'll just tell you that there's an internet joke that says, some people have a bad hair day, but now I'm having a bad hair year. So hopefully that'll be fixed soon. Okay. I know that the state of Victoria has been heavily hit by the second wave of the virus. And as an Israeli, I can totally empathize. But Australia in general has experienced terrible ecological disasters in the last few years. Almost 3 billion animals were killed or harmed by the brush fires of 2019 to 2020. So while my focus in this talk may be living with the coronavirus and its economic and social aftermath, I also mean the environmental crisis on our planet. And I think that we are living through very difficult times. I want to say, though, at the end of this introduction, that today in the Jewish calendar is a special day. It's called Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan. Now, Cheshvan can be the second month of the year or the 8th month, depending on how you start counting. So I would say it's the 8th month of the year. The 7th month of the year, Tishrei, which we just finished, was the month full of festivals. And Cheshvan has no festivals. And it's usually called Mar Cheshvan, Mar meaning bitter, because a routine life without festivals is considered to be bitter. Personally, I think getting back to routine life is something to be desired. And I don't know if we'll be back to normal, but we'll have a new normal. And it'll be interesting to see what that is. Now, I want to make 3 personal points. First of all, I think that this time has been difficult for almost everybody in the world. There may be some exceptions, and I'm thinking exceptions on the end of people who are very wealthy and privileged, but you know what? They can get sick too. Certainly, most of us have had a very rough time, but it's been in very different ways. And what do I mean by that? It really depends if you live alone or if you live with someone. It also depends whether the person you're living with is abusive and you can't stand each other, or you love them and this has been an opportunity to enhance the relationship. Are you living with children? Do these children need to go to school? What's happening with, for example, computers in the home? And are you employed or unemployed? Do you have the inner resources to keep yourself busy and active? Or are you totally bored out of your mind? I mean, all of those are very, very different variables. And I am going to be talking largely from my own experience. And those of you who know me know that I live alone. The second point that I want to make is, here a number of you are actually, I think there's at least 2 people here who are members of the synagogue that I attend. And there are some of you who have been here or even brought groups to the synagogue to visit. So you know, Kilat Yedidia, the community that I was privileged to be one of the founders of 40 years ago. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary on Zoom. We had a party on Zoom. Believe it or not, you can do it. So for us, it's been a challenge to the community. There were months where we didn't meet at all except on Zoom. And as soon as the government said that we were allowed to hold services again, but only outside, that's what we've been doing. In Israel, it's easier to hold services outside for a variety of reasons, one of which is the weather. It can be sometimes very hot during the day, but it's not going to rain yet. So we've held services outside, and we're told that if this lockdown, which is now being phased out, is successful, we may be able to open the synagogues again in November with fewer people, with social distancing, with masks, of course, following the regulations. But I'm really hoping we'll be able to get back into the building. We do have a phenomenon of what's called balcony or garden services, where people in neighborhoods have organized their own services. And to tell you the truth, when you walk through the streets of at least this part of Jerusalem on a Shabbat or a festival, it's very inspiring to hear the music, the vocal music that's coming from all these courtyards and balconies. And we've gone through the Jewish calendar, as you'll see in some of the slides coming up. And I appreciate that, because one of the things that was difficult for some people, I only read about this, I didn't experience it, was that people would wake up in the morning during the lockdown and they would say, now what day of the week is it? And they didn't know, but because I pray daily and I say the particular psalm for that day, so I always know what day of the week it is. And of course, it's necessary to know that so that you know when Shabbat is coming up, and Mark has already mentioned that. And the third point that I want to make, which might seem strange given that I had some problems connecting today, is that a good thing that's come out of this time for me personally, I no longer consider myself a technophobe. I used to really be afraid of these various machines, and I have about 4 of them in front of me. I was afraid that I was going to break them. And it goes back to a traumatic experience when I was a first-year graduate student at New York University, and I thought that I broke the key punch machine. And then they would not only not give me my degree, they might put me in jail for breaking this machine. You know, I probably didn't break it, but I have learned from my dear friend and colleague, Mark, to call this one of the rainbows in the coronavirus sky. And what has been wonderful for me personally, and this is today is an example, is the opportunity to reconnect with people all over the world. People with whom I hadn't been in touch for a long time. I certainly hadn't seen them. And now at least we can see each other and have a conversation. I think we're ready for number 3 slide, or maybe it's number 2 according to you. Right, okay. So in early March, a close friend sent me a WhatsApp message in which she wrote, "It seems that life as we know it has just changed. And it will take time to assess what changes in our lives will be lasting. And we won't know that until we are out of the woods. And maybe the biggest uncertainty is we don't know when that will be. But as Jews and Christians, we are people who have believed in lasting truths. What can we hold on to theologically, even as we realize that life around us is changing? Well, the first point is the constant need for balance between self and other, individual and community, nation and humanity. In Hebrew, we have a phrase which we started using this year on Purim, although it really applies to Pesach. We say, we lived through Pharaoh, we'll live through this. But will we come out at the other end with a balanced view of the world? And the recognition that human beings have tremendous responsibility as caretakers of the world. We are its stewards, not its masters. Now, I chose this slide because some of you may know that Purim is definitely one of my favorite festivals. And this difficult period of time for us began around the time of Purim. And unfortunately, many, particularly in the Orthodox community, ultra-Orthodox community, got infected during Purim because it's such a together kind of festival, dancing and being close together at celebrations. But the biggest challenge so far has been Pesach, and now we'll go to the next slide. Mark? Can we, yeah. And as I mentioned, I live alone, and the Pesach Seder was for me a very different kind of experience this year because I did it by myself. Under any other normal circumstances, either I would have guests, could include family or just friend, I don't want to say just because friends are very important, but could be family and or friends, or I would have been invited to someone else's home to join their celebration. But I was following the rules very strictly then. And if they said you have to be alone, I would be alone. My picture just froze. Is this a problem?
We can still hear you.
You can still hear me. Okay, well, I hope you'll be able to see me. Okay. As many of you know, we are obliged to drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder, at this festive meal, to celebrate the Israelites' liberation from Egypt. The truth is that by the 2nd cup, it didn't matter to me how many people were or weren't at the table. So I drank the 4 cups. I also went through the traditional Haggadah, the book that we read at the Seder, singing anything and everything for which I knew a melody, and in some cases more than one. And I can't really do that at a typical Seder because not everybody likes to sing, not everybody knows the melodies that I know, you know. So in that sense, it was kind of fun as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but I have made a promise to myself that I'm not going to do it again. And if, God forbid, we're in lockdown next Pesach, I'm going to break the rule. And I'm going to do the Seder with at least 2 or 3 other folks. Okay, next slide. Right. So by mid-May, I had spent 8 Shabbatot alone. That is very unusual for me, as Shabbat is generally a time of fellowship when I have guests or invited to other people's homes, as you've heard. The truth is, I'm not the world's greatest cook, and I'm a little tired of eating my own cooking. But mainly, I enjoy conversations at the table. And I would prepare in advance a lot of reading material, and I would read, but I tend to eat quickly and read quickly, and I'm sure it wasn't good for my digestion, and it certainly wasn't good for my attitude. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, Marx Borowski and Elizabeth Herzog published a book, and now we'll move to the next slide, that has become a classic on the culture of the shtetl, the Jewish village in Eastern Europe. The book is called Life is with People. And I kept thinking about that title throughout this whole period. Self-isolation and social distancing may be necessary temporarily for our survival, but they cannot become the new normal. And as long as we're talking about breaking rules, and here I'm admitting to 81 other people all over the world that I'm a delinquent, I didn't follow the rules when it came to the recent festivals, Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, Simchat Torah. On all of those occasions, either I was invited to friends or I had people over. And to me, that is something which is essential. I think, by the way, the definition of the word essential has been challenged during this period, because what is essential to one person may be completely unimportant to someone else. But for me, what is essential is some kind of human contact. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. By mid-March, all synagogues and other houses of worship were shut down, at least here. My community gathered every Friday afternoon on Zoom to welcome the Shabbat together. Those sessions have been particularly moving and meaningful. And in fact, I don't know about other people, but I spend several hours each day on Zoom. In many parts of the world, including Israel, there has been a flourishing of Jewish learning and spirituality using Zoom and other technological tools. As I mentioned, since that time, we have gone back to holding prayer services in the front, at the back, on the side of our building. And on the high holy days, when many more people go to synagogue, we had to stagger the services. I think at one point we were holding 6 different minyanim, 6 different prayer groups at different times in different spaces around the building. Now, in order to facilitate that, we also had to make the services shorter and to cut out a lot of what we normally do on those occasions. So just this past Friday night, I had a conversation with one of the leaders of the synagogue, and he said he thinks that in the future, we will always offer what he calls a corona minyan. In other words, a prayer service. Minyan is the quorum of, in our case, 10 men who must be present for the full service to take place. He said, we should offer the option for people who want it to do these kinds of shorter, streamlined services in the future, where we cut out a lot of the piyutim, a lot of the liturgical poems. And I said, well, if you want to offer it as an option, I won't object to that, but I won't choose to go to that, because for me, even though the services on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are long, the truth is I don't have all that much else to do, especially on Yom Kippur. You can't even eat. So it didn't bother me, and I really missed a lot of the singing and a lot of the things that make these days meaningful. A second thing that we've seen in many societies is a reaffirmation of basic values of decency. Love thy neighbor. The way to show love of God is by showing love to one's fellow human being through help, compassion, and devotion. As an older person, I have been the recipient of much help and kindness on the part of friends and members of my community, mainly in shopping and some other household chores. In fact, I felt so imbued with human kindness that I was doubly shocked at the beginning of the lockdown when an interfaith program I was attending on Zoom was Zoom bombed by racists and white supremacists. I had forgotten, to tell you the truth, about the negative side of social life, because everybody around me was so nice. that's the only time that I've experienced this Zoom bombing, but I think it was more prevalent then. This goes back before Pesach. And I think that Zoom developed methods of preventing this. You know, and sometimes it takes a little bit of time till the host lets you in, and there are certain other things that control who's on the program and who isn't. More worrisome than that is the phenomenon of family violence and abuse, which has been aggravated by problematic families having to spend long hours in close quarters. There have, of course, been examples of both indifference and exploitation, lying and stealing, but overwhelmingly, we've seen dedication and self-sacrifice, cooperation and love. And here I must say that all the people involved in the medical field, and certainly I mean doctors and nurses, but I mean the people who drive the ambulances and the people who clean the floors in the hospitals, and then all the people that are needed to preserve the healthcare system in our various settings. I think that they've just given a wonderful example of how people should care for each other. We have seen a fascinating choice, and here I'll ask for the next slide. Yeah, we've seen a fascinating choice made in many, but not all, nations between health and the economy. And it seems to be a kind of a struggle, although I would hope that it's not a zero-sum game. Health is a factor in the economy, and economy is a factor in health. So I think they both have to exist. But overwhelmingly, the choice has been to slow down the economy in order to save lives. And to me, that's a theological statement. One can only hope that this approach will continue. Now, I would refer you back to the Berlin document that we issued in the year 2009, we meaning the ICCJ. By the way, just a tiny correction. I wasn't the first female president. I was the first female Jewish president, because there was a Catholic lady from France who served, I think, in the 1970s. But having two women over decades of history is not such a good record. So I hope there will be more. In point 11 of the ICCJ document, we called upon religious people from the various traditions to enhance dialogue with political and economic bodies. The last bullet point is, by initiating discussion with political and economic bodies around the urgent need for justice in the global community. The aftermath of the coronavirus may provide an opportune moment for that dialogue to happen. And I see that Michael Trainer is on this call, and he and I are working together with a few other people, one of whom is a sister of Sion, Celia Deutsch, to develop a new educational guide for the Berlin document and to raise some discussion questions and ideas about how people involved in interreligious work can broaden our focus to social, political, and economic questions as well. Next slide, please. Yes. And this is something that I've been teaching for well over 50 years. And it just becomes more and more prescient all the time. And it's so appropriate. It's taken from a wonderful book by Harvey Cox, The Feast of Fools. And some of you may know Harvey Cox from an earlier book called The Secular City. Harvey Cox, in, I think, 1963, wrote a book called The Secular City, in which he suggested that religion should be focused on social justice, the inner city, working with poverty and working for social integration. Certainly something we can all agree with. But 6 years later, he underwent a little bit of a personal transformation. And he said, that's not the whole story. That's part of it. But there also has to be, as you see in the subtitle of the book, festivity and fantasy. So I'm going to read this to you. And I think, bear in mind that he wrote it in 1969 and that it is no less appropriate in 2020. Will we destroy ourselves with nuclear bombs or with man-made plagues? Or will we survive as a precarious planet where a small affluent elite perches fearfully on the top of 3 continents of hungry peons? Or will we all end up in a subhuman world of efficiently lobotomized robots? Technology need not be the enemy of the spirit in the modern world, but it should be a means to man's, and by the way, I think if he were writing it today, he would find another way of saying that, man's human fulfillment, not the symbol or goal of that fulfillment itself. When we honestly ask ourselves whether we can have such a life-affirming world, we must move beyond mere optimism or pessimism, for the empirical evidence is either mixed or unfavorable, but we can hope. Hope in the religious sense rests in part on non-empirical grounds. Christian hope suggests that man is destined for a city, and I always assume that if city has a capital C, it must be Jerusalem. It is not just any city, however. If we take the gospel images as well as the symbols of the book of Revelation into consideration, it is not only a city where injustice is abolished and there is no more crying. It is a city in which a delightful wedding feast is in progress, where the laughter rings out, the dance has just begun, and the best wine is still to be served. And I think in the context of what I mentioned earlier about Purim and Pesach and Shabbat, so I can resonate with Harvey Cox's description of what a redemptive society could look like. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is really the last thing I want to say before the final slide. One of the things that was very much emphasized in Israel during the first wave, and maybe I'm hoping that we don't hear about it so much now because it's almost taken for granted, is the very high level of cooperation between Jews and Arabs in Israel. Now, this is a good thing that comes out of a bad thing. The bad thing is that up till now, there's been a good deal of discrimination against Israeli Arabs in being accepted to certain jobs. The field in which they've done spectacularly well is everything related to pharmacology and medicine. And I think that they are disproportionately represented as pharmacists, and they are very well represented as doctors and nurses and other medical staff. And I love this picture because here are Jewish and medical and Muslim medics working together on the Israeli equivalent of what's called the Red Cross. In other countries, here it's the Red Star of David. And I have a friend, Rabbi Leah Shakdiel from Yerucham, and she said, maybe our health system was strong and efficient and effective because of this kind of collaboration, working together. And maybe if more systems had that kind of cooperation, they would be effective as well. One can only hope. Okay, last slide. And then I think there may be time for questions. So I finish with a little self-promotion. Some of you know this book, you've read it, seen it, and perhaps some of you don't, and it would be wonderful if you could get a hold of it. It is available, you know, to be ordered online. I wrote my memoirs just 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, and I noticed that if I had the privilege of meeting the Pope again, I couldn't shake his hand because of social distancing, but this was in 2005. Oh, thank you, Francis. That's lovely on the chat. But I did have the honor of meeting Pope Francis, shaking his hand and giving him not this book, but a book written by a former president of the ICCJ, Dr. Victor Goldblum of blessed memory from Canada. And he had been appointed a papal knight. So he asked me to bring his memoirs to the Pope, which I did. And you'll notice that in the title, I use this sort of play on words that we saw earlier in Harvey Cox between hope and pessimism. So I still remain a hopeful pessimist. I think the world has given us plenty of reason for pessimism, but also some reasons for hope. And I wish you all, together with your families, friends, neighbors, colleagues, that you should stay healthy and safe and continue the wonderful work that you're all doing, and that we should have an opportunity soon to meet again in person. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to handle questions.
Hello, yes, as Mark said, my name is Alex and I'm the recently appointed chair of the council. It's been such a pleasure to have Debbie with us, and of course, if it was a normal year, we wouldn't be having this on Zoom or, but as Debbie, as you said, technology is a means to human fulfillment, and you've fulfilled us very humanly by your stories, by your examples of festivals and lockdowns, and I'm in a similar position. I also live alone, and so I could very much relate to what you said. And I guess I was also a delinquent that I've went to my sister for some of the festivals, but that's a bubble, so that's not quite being a delinquent. But nonetheless, very similar, and I could very much relate. And you call yourself a hopeful pessimist. I call myself an unrealistic optimist, so I think we share that as well.